It is an honor for me to chair this panel, which presents the 2023 Bryce Book Award of the Latin American Studies Association. The 2023 Bryce Book Award recognizes an outstanding book on Latin America in the social sciences and humanities, published in English between July 1st, 2021 and June 30, 2022. This year, the winner is the excellent book, More Than a Massacre, Racial Violence and Citizenship in the Haitian and Dominican Borderlands by Sabine Cadeau, published by Cambridge University Press. LASA asked me to briefly talk about the work of the award committee, which I had the honor to chair this year, and to introduce the winner, Sabine Cadeau. The Bryce Book Award received 80 books for evaluation this year. These books come from across the disciplines that are parts of the Latin American Studies Association, such as history, political science, sociology, and literature, among others. The range of topics covered by these books was therefore broad, and the committee had the difficult task of going through all these different books and choosing an outstanding book that made an original, high-quality contribution to Latin American studies. This year, the committee had 9 members from different disciplines, including sociology, political science, history, literature, and cultural studies. The members of the selection committee were Paula Alonso from the George Washington University, Xochitl Bada from the University of Illinois, Chicago, Antonio Gomez, Tulane University, Christine Hatzky, Leibniz University, Hanover, James Mahoney, Northwestern University, Maria Rosa Olivera Williams from Notre Dame University, John Polga Hesimovich, United States Naval Academy, Kenneth Roberts, Cornell University, and myself from Universidad Torcuato de Tella in Buenos Aires. Following LASA's guidelines, to select the winner, I began as the chair by dividing the books across committee members based on their backgrounds and expertise. Each committee member was tasked with choosing 1 or 2 finalists. Then we all read the finalists and ranked them. We used those rankings to determine, in conversation, the winner and honorable mentions. These decisions were difficult not only because of the high quality of scholarship published on Latin America each year, but also because of the diversity of disciplines and topics represented in these books. The committee believes that More Than a Massacre is an excellent winner due to the significance of its contribution to the study of Latin America, the quality of the book's original research, the superb presentation of the book's research questions, findings, and analysis. More Than a Massacre offers a novel account of a racialized, anti-Haitian repression campaign that culminated in the killing of thousands of ethnic Haitians in the Dominican Republic in the 1930s. The book provides a compelling analysis of the conditions under which this atrocity took place. It also analyzes how this massacre unfolded and reframes the killings as genocide. The book is a must-read for students of the Dominican Republic and Haiti, as well as for students of violence, genocide, nation-building, citizenship, and statelessness in Latin America and beyond. The book is also a great contribution for those interested in the study of state-perpetrated violence in contexts where archives are incomplete and state violence was intentionally covered up. The book is an excellent example of how to reconstruct the events that led to violence, in this case genocidal violence, its unfolding, and the impact on its victims by incorporating oral history. Before we listen to Sabine's talk about her outstanding book, let me introduce her. Sabine Cadeau is a lecturer in African diaspora history at the University of London. She received her PhD in modern Latin American and Caribbean Atlantic history from the University of Chicago. She was also a postdoctoral fellow at Rutgers University, Yale University, and the University of Cambridge. Her research has been funded by the Andrew Mellon Foundation, the Social Science Research Council, the Woodrow Wilson Foundation, and the University of Cambridge Vice Chancellor's Endowment Fund. More Than a Massacre is her first book. Her second book, Bonds and Bondage, Fixed Income, Broken Lives, is forthcoming in 2023. Thank you very much, Sabine, for your wonderful book. Sabine will now present her book. After her presentation, we will have 30 minutes for Q&A. If you have any questions via Zoom, please use the raise your hand feature. And if those who attend in person, please raise your hands, and I will try to take as many questions as comments as possible. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Garay. Thank you for the introduction and for your thoughtful comments. It is a pleasure to be here. I want to thank the Bryce Wood Book Award Committee. I am honored to be the recipient of the Bryce Wood Book Award, and I feel quite lucky today for the wonderful opportunity to discuss my book with a community of scholars that have helped to shape my understanding of Latin America and the Caribbean. Thank you everyone for coming. In view of the conference theme on representation and human rights, it is appropriate for me to share my initial thought when I first learned that my book won the Bryce Wood Book Award. My thoughts immediately went to the testimonies of Juanis Sodis and Elias Hernandez, two Dominican citizens and border residents who were both made stateless in 1930. Sodis was kicked out of a farm where he was born and raised and deported to Haiti despite being a native-born Dominican citizen. Hernandez, who was also born in Dominican territory, complained of having no choice but to pay a high fee to register himself as a foreign immigrant. News of the award made me think that I had succeeded in telling the story of these two and many of the other ethnic Haitians who left their voices in the historical record. Elias Hernandez and Juanis Sodis stood out in my mind because their vocal objections to their mistreatment and their formal recategorization as foreigners marked the changing times along the border. Elias Hernandez was especially clear about the difference between how ethnic Haitians were treated before Trujillo's new use of Executive Order 372, which I will return to later. Defending their rights in court meant speaking out for their humanity and the protection of ethnic Haitians' rights to citizenship, property, and life itself. Though they would ultimately lose that fight, their words live to tell us of the time in which ethnic Haitians had been citizens in the Dominican Republic and of the struggles of ethnic Haitians who did as much as they were able to defend their rights. Representation of these voices fill the pages of my book as I try to narrate both a history of racial violence and the resistance against it. More than a massacre, racial violence and citizenship in the Haitian-Dominican borderlands grows out of my own effort to understand how ethnic Haitians came to be indelibly cast as foreigners in the Dominican Republic. Aware that the two societies have shared the same island for hundreds of years before either modern nation state was established, and having learned that there was a time in Dominican history when the border was unregulated, and when people of Haitian descent were accepted as Dominican citizens, I remain curious about how ethnic Haitians came to be classed exclusively as foreigners and recent migrants. In 2010, while living in Santo Domingo, I realized that despite the many layers and generations of Haitian presence, the Dominican state and the society at large refused to acknowledge the existence of a Haitian-Dominican component of their population. This widespread ideological rejection of Dominicans of Haitian descent and the concealment of Haitian influence and ancestry has been so profound that the Haitian-Dominican movement that emerged in 1983 formally demanded the rights of Dominicans of Haitian descent to exist as citizens while simultaneously acknowledging the Haitian lineage. While I was living and researching in the Dominican Republic, the Haitian-Dominican question and the Haitian-Dominican civil rights movement led by the late Sonia Pierre was propelled onto front pages around the world when a new constitution and a range of new laws and Supreme Court decisions reversed birthright citizenship in the Dominican Republic and retroactively withdrew Dominican nationality from tens of thousands of people born to Haitian parents on Dominican soil. This book does not explore the era since the fall of Trujillo in 1961, or the emergence of a more open border since the late 1980s. but political debates and social struggles surrounding race, ethnicity, and citizenship in the contemporary Dominican Republic did inform my decision to look back in the archives and explore the evolution of the crises of race and citizenship in the Dominican Republic. The historiography argued that the border was peaceful and harmoniously bicultural before the cataclysm of 1937. It also argued that unlike other genocides, the 1937 genocide had no prior history of gradual rising repression or official racism. It argued that official racism appeared in the post-massacre period. However, when I encountered the archives and saw thousands of arrests of quote unquote non-Caucasians under Executive Order 372, stretching from 1919 to 1939, I realized that we had yet to properly understand the story of 1937. What I discovered is that Executive Order 372, which placed a prohibitive tax on the entry of non-Caucasian braceros, and which would evolve to become the major repressive law that Trujillo would use against his domestic ethnic Haitian population in the lead up to 1937, was promulgated by the US Marines during their simultaneous occupation of both the Dominican Republic and Haiti in 1919. Though the scholarly literature said nothing about this key piece of racial legislation and its evolving uses in the lead up to the 1937 genocide, it was for me the clearest evidence that enabled me to understand the role of American imperialism in the 1937 genocide. More Than a Massacre recounts the tragedy of the 1937 genocide. In less than 2 weeks, an estimated 20,000 ethnic Haitians were killed. This event constituted the largest massacre of African-descended people in the Americas in the 20th century. In a region and a period known for anti-Black racism and state violence, the 1937 genocide stands out. More Than a Massacre contributes to wider literatures in Latin American history, modern nationalism, race, migration, empire, human rights, borderland studies, and the field of genocide studies. The book makes multiple interventions in the field. More Than a Massacre encourages a rethinking of the event chronologically by focusing on the period before and after the Haitian massacre. The book demonstrates that the 1937 genocide did not emerge from a vacuum. Rather, the massacre of 1937 followed almost 2 decades of anti-Haitian repression, which included mass imprisonment, displacement, patterns of racial profiling, discriminatory taxation, forced statelessness, and other forms of violence committed by the Dominican state. Prior to 1919, life in the border was fluid. However, by 1919, the American Marines introduced Executive Order 372, which explicitly policed the movement of non-Caucasian migrant laborers and prohibited non-Caucasians from entering the country until they arrived at a particular checkpoint and paid a high fee. However, Dominicans of Haitian descent who could prove their citizenship or prove their ownership of land were allowed to live in Dominican territory. And in my work, I described the difference between 1920 and 1930. Even though people were arrested in 1920, they are able to live in the Dominican Republic by proving their documents. But in 1930, it doesn't matter if they can prove their documents or not. And so this is a critical change in 1930. This all changed with President Trujillo's rise to power in 1930. At that time, Trujillo applied Executive Order 372 in an entirely new way and began the process of stripping ethnic Haitians of their rights as citizens. Now, for the first time, ethnic Haitians would experience statelessness. By weaving together evidence gleaned from government documents, court records, and oral testimonies, More Than a Massacre reframes our understanding of the 1937 genocide. reading purposefully concealed official documents about the mass killing, I attempt to read past concealment in order to make the genocide more visible as it took place. While I have written this as a history, these issues are not strictly confined to the past. Rather, as we see today, the Dominican Republic continues to promulgate laws that strip Dominicans of Haitian descent of their citizenship and uses its police powers to enforce forms of statelessness and racial violence. As with many titles, More Than a Massacre has multiple valences. Indeed, it contains many of my arguments. As I see it, there are 6 different ways in which More Than a Massacre exemplifies my arguments. First, the title grows out of oral interviews with survivors and their descendants. The memory of the massacre is not of one single event. Rather, it is a memory of multiple events. My title directly refers to survivors' insistence that the killing continued after September and October of 1937. There were waves of killing of refugees who returned to the Dominican Republic in desperate searches for food and to reclaim their land. There were repeated massacres along the militarized, dangerous, formerly closed Dominican-Haitian border for many years after 1937, with no easily definable end date. In other words, the Haitian massacre was not a single event or one major episode. The killings continued for at least a decade, and survivors insist that the post-massacre killing were important, that many thousands were killed afterwards, and that these numbers must be taken into account in any assessment of the number of people killed. They also expressed even more horror and shock at the thought that even after surviving the initial outbreak, that more of their friends and loved ones were killed. Second, 1937 was both a massacre and a genocide. State sources show this was intentional, premeditated, and also carefully concealed and misrepresented before, during, and after the event. Chapters 4 and 5 of the book discuss my approach to genocide and demonstrate my method for reading state concealment. Many of my most important sources themselves record the authorities' careful efforts to distort and conceal the overall genocide by using euphemisms such as campaign and displacement. In the 1940s, military authorities wrote as if a massacre never took place. The term desalojo was used as part of this denial. Indeed, the use of words and phrases such as el desalojo are especially important. The use of words such as desalojo or displacement actually influenced the historiography that mistakenly accepted a distinction between a massacre in the North and displacement in the South. Rather than a regionally distinct phenomenon, I have interpreted the massacre as a coordinated nationwide genocide in which displacement and deportation cannot be easily separated from widespread murder. While some historians contrasted the North and the South, my sources allowed me to look into the least known area, the central border around Macacias, shown here, where the Macacias and Libon rivers delineate the border. In these most remote and most rugged areas, cross-border conflict flared up as displaced ethnic Haitians in one case set fire to Dominican buildings and threatened to reclaim lost land. I visited this area and managed to find relatives of the author of this arson attack who recounted a multi-generational regional history of displacement and violence. I also wanted to point out people to the Libon River, especially people who have heard of the 1937 massacre, because the killings of the 1937 massacre is often associated with the Massacre River that we see here. But there are other rivers that people associate with with the blood of Haitian bodies, and the Libon River figures prominently in that memory. So third, 1937 was also more than a massacre because the event had a lasting legacy on the meaning and boundaries of Dominican citizenship. From 1937 onward, the country would refuse to accept the possibility of ethnically Haitian citizens or permanent residents. Haitians from that point on were racially confined to the sugar economy and later to other strictly policed economic areas. Dominican nationality was thus forcefully defined as other than Haitian. Indeed, to carry Haitian identity was stigmatized. Fourth, the event set the stage for decades of Dominicanization policy that followed 1937, that shaped the country's entire subsequent history. Dominicanization involved a strict but not entirely enforceable closed border policy, intense surveillance and spying, forcible relocation of people away from the border, and the policing of language, religion, and even certain foodways. Families were divided. Vigilantes were issued with shotguns to guard the border, and concrete buildings, radios, and billiard tables were celebrated as living proof of the modernity, the Hispanidad, and the material superiority of the era of Trujillo. The important point is that this event had a defining legacy that helped to solidify the racial, ethnic, and cultural meaning of Dominican citizenship and identity. Fifth, I also argue that the 1937 genocide was one of the most important histories of a land grab in Latin American history in the 20th century. Ethnic Haitians interpreted and defined this event as none other than a land grab, a form of theft to take away Haitian property and border territories that were home to heavily concentrated ethnic Haitian populations. This is a point that victims repeatedly made. They were not simply killed and driven off. They had their land, their homes, their crops, and their livestock pillaged by soldiers, by civilian deputies who participated in the killing, and by otherwise innocent bystanders who appropriated fields, livestock, and domestic goods. The victims, both in the testimonies that they recorded upon arrival in Haiti and in the testimonies they continued to give, repeatedly emphasized the land and the crops that they lost, with many remembering exact numbers of cattle or exact acreages in rice or bananas. And it's interesting to interview people because they really remember the exact number, and they would say, my grandfather had 100 cattle. I mean, it's just, so it was really interesting to hear these accounts. At a larger level, the land grab was about entire regions and provinces that the two countries were negotiating over. And when a changing border crossed particular communities, there emerged a partition-like history, including not only the slaughter of 1937, but also attempts to repatriate ethnic Dominicans who wound up on the Haitian side of the border. Trujillo's government violently displaced ethnically Haitian communities and indeed brought so-called real Dominicans to repopulate those areas. And some of these so-called real Dominicans were actually the Dominicans who lived on the Haitian side of the border. 6, the word massacre also implies a one-sided slaughter. And this is mainly what it was. But I also point out that this history was more than a massacre in the sense that ethnic Haitians were not entirely passive victims. I discuss isolated but interesting examples of armed resistance and revenge through arson. There was also a much more widespread pattern of resistance that emerged in the border areas. Secret border farms cultivated on Dominican territory in the most remote and inaccessible mountainous regions of the area. And when I want to say that in my book, I discuss secret border farms as the most widespread and common forms of resistance. And Dominican authorities were very concerned about the secret border farms. They would go and destroy the secret border farms, but they would pop up like weeds. And so they were never really able to destroy the secret border farms. And in this, and they were frustrated about it because it threatened Dominicans claims to land, the state's official claim to land, and the fact that the state is weak and cannot actually protect its territories, and just the idea that the land was still contested, that these survivors were contesting Dominicans' claim to these areas. Finally, Massacre also inscribes memories. For the victims, the memory and the conflict loom large. Desires to take back the land made their way to the campaign speeches in Haiti's historic 1946 election, when the desperate incumbent candidate Elias Hernandez sent his son to do stump speeches in border areas to rally voters with empty promises to retake lost Haitian land in the north. Memories of particular forms of violence during the 1937 genocide has also been stamped in the minds of survivors, especially those memories that highlight the thirst to kill as many as possible and instill indelible memories of terror, such as the iconic memory of babies torn up in the air and killed on bayonets, the memory of the killers setting traps to kill the maximum number of people at the very edge of the border, and babies left behind to nurse on their dead mother's breast. While these are important themes in More Than a Massacre, the core of my argument lies with the events of 1930. The fundamental turning point that I emphasize are the promulgation of Executive Order 372 in 1919, and then the rise of Trujillo in 1930. And it's important to remember again that I trace the origin of statelessness in the Dominican Republic to 1930. And in 1930, Trujillo's new government used Executive Order 372 to round people up and tear up their citizenship rights. Before 1930, this did not happen, even though they were enforcing Executive Order 372. Even when people did not have their documents at hand, they could have a Dominican godparent or a Dominican friend to confirm that they were citizens. And in 1930, that doesn't matter anymore. So this is a real change. 1930 was a fundamental turning point in the history of the border for this reason. My work takes an event that was treated as one-of-a-kind aberration and demonstrates that it had a very important before and after. The before was 2 decades of evolving border enforcement, rounds up, displacement, discriminatory taxation, and denationalization of people who were legally transformed from citizens or residents and deported as foreigners. People had their rights, their citizenship, and their livelihoods taken away for years before many of them had their lives taken in 1937. 1937 was an escalation and a culmination of years of repressive policy. Statelessness for many victims preceded the genocide by 7 years. I argue against a historiography that sees the 1937 genocide as the beginning and end of an exceptional episode. For me, it was a slow burn, punctuated by a major explosion that smolders to this day. This is a key intervention for understanding the 1937 genocide. My book demonstrates that the 1937 genocide was not an exception in the history of genocides in the 20th century. Previous historians of the 1937 Haitian massacre argued that there was no gradual buildup of repression unlike other genocides in the 20th century. As we see with Executive Order 372, there was repression and racial discrimination before 1937. The 1937 genocide remains absent and ignored in the field of genocide studies. The erasure of the event has had to do with the time period that it took place, the active suppression and concealment of the event, and the Haitian state also participated in that suppression, and the fact that the victims were Black. Perhaps above all, More Than a Massacre argues for the incorporation of the long-forgotten 1937 genocide in the wider literature on genocide. From at least 1919, the border was not harmonious and it was no longer open. Only the extremes of mass killing and the shoot-on-sight closed border policy of 1937 made the prior years seem relatively harmonious by contrast. There was a slow deterioration of ethnic Haitians' legal status on Dominican territory from 1919. During the 1920s, Executive Order 372 was repeatedly used to round up ethnic Haitians. However, throughout the 1920s, the court records show that thousands of them were able to use their birthplace, their ownership of property on Dominican soil, and even the testimony of locals to get out of jail and avoid deportation. And the point that I wanted to make here too is that Dominican border residents, Dominican judges, and some of them were Haitian judges, were also very protective of Haitian rights before 1930. By 1930, however, immediately upon the rise of Trujillo, local courts began to ignore appeals to birthplace or property and started deporting Dominican-born people or forcing them to pay for costly immigration permits on the basis of their race and ethnicity, notwithstanding their place of birth and the fact that they qualified as Dominican citizens according to the Constitution. By 1930, many of these ethnic Haitians were rendered stateless people. I identify this point as the origin of statelessness in the Dominican Republic. Many were deported and others remained on Dominican territory as foreigners in their native land. This is why the main argument of my book hinges on this fundamental turning point in 1930. Arrested in 1930 under Executive Order 372, Elias Hernandez, born in Santiago, spoke out in court against what he considered to be his unjust imprisonment. And unable to return home to prove his birthplace, he found himself forced to pay for an immigration permit in the country of his birth. Without falling into a narrative of predetermined outcomes, as Trujillo's choices were clearly behind the campaign of mass murder, I analyzed the 17 years before the 1937 massacre as a clear, unidirectional deterioration in the status of ethnic Haitians in the Dominican Republic. This history of slow, gradual, but also punctuated formal deterioration in the legal status of an ethnic minority and the eventual cancellation of their civil rights and their citizenship status is an important point of comparison between this genocide and other 20th century genocide. People were wiped out juridically before being physically killed or displaced. This also offers a broader lens for understanding statelessness in Latin American and Caribbean history in the 20th century, as well as the range of disastrous effects of racism in the 20th century. Taking seriously the role of Executive Order 372 helps us to understand better the role of American imperialism in exacerbating racial conflict in Latin America. This event is a mirror for understanding more deeply the role of US imperialism in the 20th century, and the history of racial violence, genocides, and citizenship in Latin America from the colonial period until the present. If the 1937 genocide had been forgotten in the field of genocide studies, might we identify others in Latin America that could be studied in light of genocide studies? Before we end, I would like to show these documents from my book because I'm very proud of having been able to publish them. The Dominican government never gave me consent to publish them. But I had to ask for permission, I think, because the images, can you see it? Yeah. Oh, well, thank you. So I really liked, so I'm very proud of these documents, and I think it's, and I learned a lot in terms of trying to, and when I tried to publish them. So, so these So even though the, technically there's no data protection rules, I think, but they are images. And so I did have to consult the Dominican archives and ask for permission. But there was just delay and just other bureaucratic rationalization for why I could not really publish it. So, you know, this for me represent an ongoing legacy of concealment. The Dominican state continues to try to hide the truth. These special finds in the Dominican archives are proof that many ethnic Haitians had documents. Not only did they have documents, as you will see with Gonzalez and can you see both? It's, Gonzalez and Eliseo. These documents were confiscated in 1939. So it's also also evidence of the ongoing violence that continued after 1937. So I think this is also represents my effort to read concealment. I think these two men were actually killed in 1939, but somehow their documents appear to have slipped through the cracks in the Dominican archives, and they represent poignant proof of the denationalization process and speak to the arrests and deportations that accompanied the genocidal agenda of Trujillo's regime. Thank you very much for coming today, and I look forward to the Q&A.
Well, thank you very much, Sabine, for your presentation. So if there are any questions in the room or on Zoom, I think if you have any questions on Zoom, you can raise your hand, use the Zoom feature, or use the chat to write the question.
Elias Hernandez Medina from the Dominican Republic, based at Pomona College. Oh, okay. So that they can
So they can see
Sure,
you.
okay.
Yes, okay.
Thank you. Yeah, I just want to ask you to, well, first of all, this looks like amazing work. I'm looking forward to reading it. And it's so important, being from the Dominican Republic, being from, part of the groups that are trying to rescue this history so that we can change the present and the very complicated relationship we still have between the two countries. And especially, I loved when you mentioned, I'm part of the Dominican feminist movement. So I loved also when you mentioned Sonia Pierre and, her legacy and all her work. So I have a lot of questions, but I'm going to let other people intervene. What I would like to, Pauline, Pauline has a question. What I would like to hear more about is about the role, and you emphasized this at the end of your remarks. If you can talk a little bit more about the role that the US played, because other authors are talking about, of course, you're emphasizing the executive order, but other authors are talking about this happening even earlier. So for instance, not even necessarily government interventions, but even, travelers from the US and people, and also the US government always making this difference between what is the Dominican Republic and between Haiti, basically pitting both peoples against each other, right? So, Dominicans are quote unquote more civilized because they're light-skinned compared to Haitians and that kind of stuff. So I know that you have a specific period, but what other things did you find, or if you want to expand on that part? And again, amazing work.
Thank you.
Really looking forward to it.
I don't my glasses. I'm sorry. What I actually found very interesting in the sources is that the United States in the early 20th century doesn't exactly conceive, the United States in the early 20th century doesn't exactly conceive of Dominicans and Haitians as separate races. So I think that there was a lot of ideological work done with during the Trujillo regime to define Dominicans as non-Black. I mean, I think underground, maybe you can say military Marines sometimes saw, made differences between, skin color, but American officials do not exactly see Dominicans and Haitians as different. As a matter of fact, and I think this is because of Americans' own racial categories, right? So as a matter of fact, one of the reasons why the US government doesn't really respond to the 1937 massacre is because they understood it as a massacre between two Negro states. Quote, this is a comment that you find in the sources. So I don't think that the US always saw the Dominican Republic as different. I think there's more we need to understand about how the US actually perceived the Dominican Republic. I think they also saw them as Black, and perhaps not, and perhaps you can say that some Americans were at least underground in terms of the Marines. Maybe there was some differentiation underground in terms of skin color, but ultimately officials really see them as, they still see Dominicans as Black. So I think it's, yeah. So maybe, and it's interesting because I think they learned a lot about the Dominicans and the Haitians during the occupation. So I think they see colorism rather than between Dominicans and Haitians at times, rather than race, because they state documents show that like even in 1937 that they do see Dominicans as Black. That's how they see them. Yeah, thank you. And I think in terms of more of the American role, I mean, the American was central to just the whole, like to the border treaties that we see. They were the mediators. So that's one of the roles that they played.
Sabine, I think you have a question in the chat. Do you want me to read it?
Okay.
So it's a question by Pauline Gonzalez. So it says, how much did the border agreement from 1929 influence the 1937 massacre?
So, I mean, I think it's a different, in a way, it could, I mean, one can imagine that because there was a treaty and Dominicans could formally claimed control of Restauration and other borders that they argued for, that this was a reason not to kill Haitians. So you can see that argument, but it seems to me that one of the problems, I don't know if you want to call it an influence, but you can see, but it seems to me that once some of these border regions became formerly Dominicans, there was a sense that they weren't really Dominican, because whatever Dominican is, but because there were a lot of, because many of these provinces were heavily concentrated Haitian areas. So perhaps the next step of reclaiming these border treaties from the perspective of the Dominican state is to kill and wipe out these Haitians so that these territories can fully become Dominican. So there's a fear of, there's still a fear of you can say of Haitianism, of Haitian takeover, or that these lands are not really Dominican because they are majority Haitian. So I don't know if you want to call that, and so maybe the influence there is that the Haitian demographic, these regions had formerly become Dominican, but yet they weren't really Dominican. And I hate to use that because I hate to use the state's definition of Dominican, but their perception of what Dominican represents. Another question? No? Any more comments? Any more questions? Well,
don't-
I have a comment. Please read my book.
Yeah,
So, and feel free to email me with any questions. I love hearing people's comments about my book and just people's interpretation of the book. Helps me to understand my own work. So I'm still thinking about this event. Thank you.
yeah, thank you. Yeah, I also recommend, and the entire committee recommends everyone to read your book, which is absolutely amazing.
Thank you, Candelaria. Thank you.